The blood pooled beneath my stepfather's collapsed form as I knelt beside him in our mansion's marble foyer, my hands shaking as I pressed against the wound. Call 911! I screamed at my stepsister Vivian, but she just stood there filming with her phone, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Oops, she said, not lowering the camera. I guess I was too slow to catch him when he fell down those stairs. My stepmother Elena emerged from the kitchen, took one look at the scene, and sighed dramatically. Well, I suppose we should call the paramedics. Though, honestly, Richard, this is rather inconvenient timing with the charity gala tomorrow. I watched in horror as my stepfather, the only person in this family who had ever shown me kindness, died in my arms while they stood there like vultures. The last thing I saw was Vivian's satisfied smirk before everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was 16 again, standing in the same foyer 3 years earlier. But this time, I remembered everything. The memories hit me like a physical blow, so vivid and complete that I staggered against the marble pillar. Every detail was crystal clear. The feel of Richard's blood on my hands, the sound of Vivian's laughter as she filmed his death, the complete indifference in Elena's voice as she discussed the inconvenience of his murder. But more than that, I remembered the years that had led to that moment. The systematic destruction of Richard Morrison, telecommunications billionaire, and the kindest man I had ever known. The way my family had slowly poisoned him, isolated him, and stolen everything he had built over 60 years of hard work. In this timeline, Richard was still alive, still sharp, still the brilliant businessman who had connected rural America to the digital age. He was sitting in his study right now, probably reviewing quarterly reports or mentoring young entrepreneurs through his foundation. He had no idea that his own family was planning to destroy him. The abuse had started so subtly that I hadn't recognized it at first. After my mother died when I was 12, my father had remarried Elena within 6 months. She came with her 18-year-old daughter, Vivian, and her elderly father, Richard, who had reluctantly moved in with us after a minor stroke, left him slightly unsteady on his feet. Elena was a master manipulator who understood that perception was everything. In public, she was the devoted wife who had taken on the challenging task of raising a grieving stepdaughter. She volunteered at my school, attended every parent-teacher conference, and spoke eloquently about the importance of blended families supporting each other through difficult times. Behind closed doors, she was a monster. It started with small cruelties. She would accidentally wash my favorite clothes with bleach, then apologize profusely while suggesting that I was being too sensitive about just fabric. She would cook elaborate family dinners and then claim there wasn't enough food for me, offering me a sandwich instead, while everyone else enjoyed her roast beef and homemade bread. When I complained to my father, Elena would look hurt and confused. "I don't understand why Claire is so hostile toward me," she would say, tears welling in her eyes. "I've tried so hard to be a good mother to her, but she seems determined to push me away. Maybe she needs counseling to help her process her grief." My father, overwhelmed by his own grief and desperate to believe that his new marriage could heal our broken family, chose to side with Elena. "Your stepmother is trying her best," he would tell me. "I know this is hard, but we need to work together as a family." Vivian learned quickly from her mother's example. She was 3 years older than me and understood exactly how to torment me while maintaining plausible deniability. She would borrow my clothes without asking and return them damaged, then claim that I must have been careless with them. She would invite friends over and exclude me from their activities, then tell my father that I had chosen to isolate myself. The worst incident happened when I was 14. I had been working for months on a science fair project about renewable energy, staying up late every night to perfect my solar panel design. The night before the competition, I woke up to find that someone had destroyed it completely. The panels were smashed, the display board was covered in red paint, and my research notes were burned in the fireplace. Vivian claimed that she had found me sleepwalking and destroying it myself. Elena backed up her story, suggesting that I was having a breakdown due to stress and unresolved grief. My father, faced with the choice between believing his troubled daughter or his concerned wife and stepdaughter, chose them. I was sent to therapy twice a week and put on medication for anxiety and depression. The therapist, Dr. Morrison, was recommended by Elena and seemed more interested in confirming her theories about my mental state than actually helping me. Every session felt like an interrogation designed to prove that I was unstable and potentially dangerous. But the cruelest aspect of their abuse was how they treated Richard. Richard Morrison had built Morrison Telecommunications from nothing, starting with a single radio repair shop in rural Montana and growing it into a $1 billion empire that brought internet access to underserved communities across America. He was brilliant, kind, and generous. Everything his daughter Elena was not. When he moved in with us after his stroke, Richard was still sharp and actively involved in running his company. But Elena immediately began working to undermine his independence. She convinced him that he was more confused than he actually was, questioning his decisions and making him doubt his own memories. "Dad, you already told me about that business meeting," she would say when he shared something interesting about his day. "Don't you remember? We talked about it at breakfast." Richard would look confused and worried. "Did I? I'm sorry, Elena. I don't remember repeating myself." "It's okay, Dad. The stroke affected your memory more than you realize. That's why it's so important that you let me help you with the important decisions." Gradually, Elena convinced Richard to give her power of attorney just as a precaution. She started attending his business meetings and reviewing his financial decisions. She hired new lawyers and accountants, people who were loyal to her rather than to Richard's interests. I watched this happening and tried to intervene, but I was just a teenager with a documented history of behavioral problems. When I tried to tell Richard what Elena was doing, she would frame it as another example of my instability. "Claire has been having some difficulties," she would explain to him sadly. "The therapist thinks she might be developing paranoid tendencies. We're working with her, but in the meantime, we need to be careful not to feed into her delusions." Richard loved me and wanted to believe I was okay, but Elena's gaslighting was relentless and effective. Slowly, he began to question whether my concerns were real or just symptoms of my supposed mental illness. The financial abuse escalated quickly once Elena had control. She started by redirecting Richard's charitable donations to organizations she controlled. Then she began selling off parts of his business portfolio, claiming that diversification was necessary for his financial security. The money went into accounts that she managed, supposedly for Richard's benefit, but actually for her own use. Vivian was Elena's enthusiastic accomplice. She had expensive tastes and no moral compass, and she saw Richard's wealth as her inheritance. She started living like a celebrity. Designer clothes, luxury cars, exotic vacations, all funded by money stolen from her grandfather. When I turned 16, Richard tried to give me a car for my birthday. A modest Honda that would help me get to school and my part-time job. Elena intervened, claiming that I was too unstable to drive safely and that the money would be better spent on my therapy and medication. Instead, the car went to Vivian, who already had a BMW that Richard had bought her the year before. My father died suddenly of a heart attack when I was 17, and I hoped that his death might change the family dynamics. Instead, it made everything worse. Elena no longer had to pretend to care about my well-being, and she moved quickly to eliminate me as a threat to her plans. She convinced Richard to change his will, removing me as a beneficiary and leaving everything to her and Vivian. She claimed that I was too mentally unstable to handle an inheritance, and that she would hold my father's assets in trust until I could prove I was capable of managing money responsibly. The trust, of course, was structured in a way that made it nearly impossible for me to ever access the funds. Elena and her lawyers created a maze of requirements and evaluations that could be used to delay or deny my inheritance indefinitely. By the time I turned 18, Richard's health was declining rapidly. Elena claimed it was natural aging and the long-term effects of his stroke, but I suspected something more sinister. He was often confused and lethargic, symptoms that got worse whenever Elena gave him his medication. I tried to research what she was giving him, but Elena kept all his medical information locked away. When I suggested that Richard see a different doctor for a second opinion, she became furious. "How dare you question his medical care?" she screamed at me. "You're not a doctor, Claire. You're a disturbed teenager with no education and no understanding of complex medical issues. Richard is getting the best possible care, and your paranoid conspiracy theories are not helping anyone." She used that incident as justification to have me evaluated by a psychiatrist, Dr. Harrison, who was another one of her carefully chosen allies. After a single session where I tried to explain my concerns about Richard's treatment, Dr. Harrison recommended that I be hospitalized for intensive psychiatric evaluation and treatment. I spent 3 months locked in a psychiatric facility while Elena and Vivian accelerated their theft of Richard's assets. They sold his house, liquidated his investment accounts, and transferred millions of dollars to offshore accounts. When I was finally released, I found that Richard had been moved to a nursing home and was barely responsive. The stress of your accusations really affected him, Elena told me with fake sadness. The doctors say he may never recover fully. This is why we need to protect him from any more emotional trauma. I was forbidden from visiting Richard without Elena's supervision, and she made sure those visits were brief and carefully monitored. Richard would look at me with confusion and fear, as if he couldn't quite remember who I was or why I was there. The final blow came when I turned 21 and tried to claim my father's inheritance. Elena's lawyers informed me that the trust had been modified due to my mental health issues, and that I would need to undergo extensive psychological evaluation before any funds could be released. The evaluation process was designed to be humiliating and impossible. I was required to see multiple psychiatrists, undergo neurological testing, and submit to questioning about every aspect of my personal life. Elena's lawyers portrayed me as a dangerous and unstable individual who had been making false accusations against her family for years. After 2 years of legal battles that drained what little money I had, I gave up. I was broke, isolated, and completely defeated. Elena had won everything: Richard's money, my father's assets, and my reputation. But the story didn't end there. When I was 25, Richard died alone in the nursing home. Elena claimed that his death was peaceful and expected, but I knew better. I had seen the bruises on his arms during my last supervised visit, the look of terror in his eyes when Elena walked into the room. I tried to demand an autopsy, but Elena had power of attorney and refused to authorize one. Richard was cremated quickly, and his ashes were scattered in a private ceremony that I wasn't invited to attend. That's when I snapped. I spent months researching Elena and Vivian's financial activities, trying to find evidence of their theft. I hired a private investigator with the last of my money and slowly began to build a case against them. But they had been careful, and their lawyers were excellent at covering their tracks. The confrontation came on a cold December evening, exactly 3 years before I would be reborn. I had finally gathered enough evidence to file a lawsuit, and I went to the family house to confront Elena and Vivian with what I had discovered. "You killed him," I told them, spreading financial documents across the dining room table. "You stole everything he had, and then you killed him." Elena looked at the papers calmly, then smiled. "Oh, Claire. Still making up stories, I see. Richard died of natural causes, as confirmed by his doctor. And as for these financial documents, I'm afraid you don't understand what you're looking at." "I understand perfectly," I said. "You transferred $47 million out of his accounts in the last 2 years of his life. You sold his properties and businesses for far below market value to companies you control. You've been poisoning him with psychiatric medications that weren't prescribed for him." Vivian laughed. "Prove it," she said. "Prove any of it. You're a mentally ill woman with a history of making false accusations. Who's going to believe you?" That's when I realized they were right. They had spent years destroying my credibility and isolating me from anyone who might help. Even if I could prove their crimes, no one would listen to me. The argument escalated, and Vivian pushed me down the same marble stairs where Richard would later die. I survived the fall, but suffered a traumatic brain injury that left me unable to work or live independently. Elena and Vivian became my legal guardians, claiming that they were generously caring for their disabled family member. In reality, they kept me prisoner in the house, stealing my disability payments while presenting themselves as devoted caregivers to the outside world. For 2 years, I lived in a fog of medication and confusion, barely aware of what was happening around me. But occasionally the fog would lift, and I would remember everything: Richard's kindness, Elena's cruelty, the systematic destruction of everything good in our family. The final insult came when Elena decided that Richard had fallen down the stairs in a tragic accident. She needed his death to look natural so she could claim his remaining life insurance policies. and she thought that staging another staircase accident would be poetic justice. But as I knelt beside Richard's dying body, something inside me snapped. The fog cleared completely, and I saw everything with perfect clarity. The years of abuse, the stolen money, the deliberate destruction of a good man's life and legacy. I died that night, overwhelmed by rage and grief and the terrible knowledge that Elihina and Vivian had won completely. But death wasn't the end. Now I stood in the same foyer 3 years earlier, with all my memories intact and a chance to change everything. Richard was upstairs in his study, alive and healthy and still in control of his empire. Elena and Vivian were planning their first moves in what they thought would be a long campaign of financial abuse. They had no idea that their victim had already died once and come back to destroy them. The first thing I did was different from my original timeline. Instead of retreating to my room to process the overwhelming return of memories, I went directly to Richard's study. He looked up from his computer when I knocked, his face lighting up with the warm smile that I had missed so desperately. "Claire, come in, sweetheart. I was just reviewing some reports, but I always have time for my favorite granddaughter." "Grandpa Richard," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Can I ask you something important?" "Of course, what's on your mind?" "Have you ever thought about what would happen if something happened to you? I mean, who would make sure your wishes were followed?" His expression grew more serious. "That's a very mature question for someone your age. Why are you thinking about such things?" I chose my words carefully. "I've been reading about elder abuse for a school project. Did you know that family members are responsible for over 90% of financial crimes against elderly people?" Richard frowned. "That's a disturbing statistic. But I trust Elena completely. She's been helping me manage some of my affairs, and she's very competent." "I'm sure she is," I said. "But wouldn't it be smart to have some safeguards in place? Not because you don't trust her, but because it protects everyone involved?" Over the next several weeks, I carefully planted seeds of concern about the legal protections around his assets. I brought him articles about estate planning and elder law, framing my interest as academic curiosity rather than personal worry. Richard was brilliant, and once he started thinking about the issues, he reached his own conclusions about the need for better safeguards. He hired a new estate planning attorney, one I had carefully researched and suggested, and began restructuring his legal affairs to include multiple oversight mechanisms. But my real advantage was my knowledge of Elena and Vivian's patterns. I knew exactly when and how they would make their moves, and I was ready for each one. The first test came 2 months into my rebirth, when Elena tried to convince Richard to sign papers giving her expanded power of attorney. In my original timeline, I had been at school when this happened, and Richard had signed without understanding the full implications. This time, I was ready. "Grandpa Richard," I said, appearing in his study just as Elena was spreading the documents across his desk. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something wrong with the garage door. It won't close, and I'm worried about security." Elena looked annoyed at the interruption, but Richard immediately got up to investigate. "We can't leave the garage open overnight," he said. "Elena, we'll have to review these papers later." "Of course, Dad," Elena said smoothly. "Family safety comes first." Once Richard was distracted with the garage door issue, which I had quietly sabotaged earlier, I quickly photographed the documents Elena had brought. Later that night, I researched every clause and provision, understanding exactly how they were designed to give Elena complete control over Richard's finances. When Richard returned to sign the papers the next day, I was ready with questions. "Grandpa, I was doing some research for my economics class about power of attorney documents. Can I ask you about some of the provisions in what you're signing?" I proceeded to ask seemingly innocent questions that highlighted the most problematic aspects of the documents. Richard, with his sharp business mind, immediately saw the issues I was pointing out. "Elena," he said slowly, "this language gives you the right to make decisions without consulting me. That seems excessive." Elena's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dad, you know I would never make any major decisions without talking to you first. This is just a legal formality to make sure I can help you if there's an emergency." "But why does it need to be so broad?" Richard asked. "Claire's questions are making me think we should have the attorney review this more carefully." That night, Elena confronted me in my room. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her mask of maternal concern completely gone. I don't know what you mean, I said innocently. I was just asking questions for my homework. Don't play games with me, Claire. You're trying to turn Richard against me, and I won't allow it. I'm not trying to turn anyone against anyone, I said. I just think it's important that Grandpa Richard understands what he's signing. Don't you? Elena's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're walking a very thin line, young lady. I've been patient with your behavioral problems, but if you continue to cause trouble in this family, there will be consequences. I met her stare steadily. What kind of consequences? The kind that involve psychiatric evaluation and residential treatment, she said softly. You've been showing signs of paranoid delusions and oppositional behavior. Dr. Morrison has already expressed concerns about your mental state. It was the same threat she had used in my original timeline, but this time I was ready for it. That's interesting, I said, because I've been keeping a journal of our family interactions for my therapy sessions. Dr. Patterson thinks it's a good way for me to process my feelings about our blended family dynamic. Elena's face went pale. Dr. Patterson was my actual therapist, not the one Elena had chosen for me. I had started seeing him in secret, paying for sessions with money I earned from babysitting and tutoring. What kind of journal? Elena asked carefully. Oh, just notes about conversations, family dynamics, that sort of thing. Dr. Patterson says it helps him understand how everyone is adjusting to our new family structure. The implied threat was clear. If Elena tried to have me institutionalized, I had a record of her behavior that could be presented to an independent mental health professional. Elena left my room without another word, but I knew this was just the beginning of our war. Over the next several months, I systematically undermined every aspect of Elena and Vivian's plan. When they tried to isolate Richard from his old friends and business associates, I quietly arranged for those people to have reasons to visit or call. When they attempted to redirect his charitable giving, I made sure Richard learned about the true purposes of the organizations Elena was promoting. Most importantly, I began documenting everything. I bought a tiny recording device with money from my part-time job and hid it in my clothing during family interactions. I installed hidden cameras in common areas of the house, disguised as decorative objects that no one would think to examine closely. I kept detailed written records of every conversation, every suspicious financial transaction, every instance of abuse or manipulation. But my masterstroke was the laptop. For my 17th birthday, I asked for a high-end computer for college applications and schoolwork. What Elena and Vivian didn't know was that I had installed advanced monitoring software that would track every keystroke, every login, every financial transaction made on any device connected to our home network. I watched through hidden digital surveillance as Vivian accessed Richard's accounts using passwords she had stolen. I recorded Elena forging his signature on documents. I documented their systematic attempts to transfer assets to accounts they controlled. The evidence I gathered was devastating, but I needed more than just proof of their crimes. I needed to make sure that when I destroyed them, they would have no way to recover. That's where Marcus Chen came in. Marcus had been Richard's business partner in the early days of Morrison Telecommunications, and they had remained close friends even after Marcus sold his stake in the company to pursue other ventures. In my original timeline, Elena had successfully cut off contact between Marcus and Richard, claiming that the stress of business discussions was bad for Richard's health. This time, I made sure that didn't happen. I started by accidentally mentioning Marcus during dinner conversations, talking about articles I had read about his new ventures and expressing admiration for his business success. Richard would light up whenever Marcus's name came up, clearly missing his old friend. You should call him, I suggested one evening. I bet he would love to hear from you. Elena thinks it's better if I avoid stressful business conversations, Richard said hesitantly. But you're not talking business, I pointed out. You're talking to a friend. That's completely different. When Elena tried to discourage the contact, I was ready with counter-arguments. Mom, Elena, I said sweetly, don't you think social connections are important for Grandpa's mental health? My psychology teacher says that isolation is one of the worst things for elderly people. Elena couldn't argue against that without looking unreasonable, especially in front of Richard. Reluctantly, she allowed the renewed friendship, not realizing that Marcus would become one of my most important allies. Marcus was sharp, successful, and genuinely caring. When I carefully shared some of my concerns about the family dynamics, he immediately understood what I was telling him. Are you saying what I think you're saying? He asked during one of our private conversations. I'm not saying anything directly, I replied, but I think someone who cares about Grandpa Richard should be paying attention to what's happening around him. Marcus began his own quiet investigation, using his business connections and financial expertise to trace some of the suspicious transactions I had identified. What he found confirmed my worst fears. Elena and Vivian had already stolen nearly $15 million dollars, and they were accelerating their timeline. They're planning something big, Marcus told me during a secret meeting at a coffee shop near my school. The pattern of transfers suggests they're preparing to move major assets very soon. What do you think their end game is? I asked. I think they're going to have Richard declared incompetent, Marcus said grimly. Once they have complete control, they can liquidate everything and disappear. That's when I knew it was time to make my move. The trap I set was elegant in its simplicity. I used my knowledge of their plans to stay one step ahead, carefully maneuvering them into a position where they would reveal their true intentions in ways that could be documented and prosecuted. First, I arranged for Richard to meet with a new estate planning attorney, one who specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial abuse. I framed this as a routine update to his legal documents, nothing more. The attorney, Sarah Kim, was brilliant and experienced. When I privately shared some of my concerns with her, she immediately understood the situation and began implementing subtle safeguards. Mr. Morrison, she said during their first meeting, I always recommend that clients have multiple people review any major financial decisions. Would you be comfortable having your friend Marcus Chen serve as a secondary advisor? Richard agreed enthusiastically, not knowing that this simple change would make it much harder for Elena to continue her theft. Next, I planted evidence that would lead Elena and Vivian to accelerate their timeline in a way that would expose them. I accidentally left some college brochures around the house, along with notes about expensive tuition costs and my concerns about paying for my education. I made sure Elena overheard me talking to friends about my plans to major in business and possibly join Richard's company after graduation. The message was clear. I was becoming a threat to their long-term plans, and they needed to move faster. Sure enough, within 2 weeks, Elena announced that Richard needed to make some important financial decisions for tax purposes before the end of the year. It's all very technical, she explained to Richard over dinner. But my accountant says we need to restructure some of your assets to avoid tax penalties. What kind of restructuring? I asked innocently. Elena's smile was tight. Nothing you need to worry about, Claire. This is adult business. But Richard was curious too. Elena, I'd like to understand what you're recommending. Can you have your accountant explain it to me in detail? Of course, Dad. I'll set up a meeting. That meeting became the centerpiece of my trap. I made sure Marcus was included in the discussion, along with Sarah Kim and a financial advisor that Richard trusted. Elena brought her own team of lawyers and accountants, confident that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. What she didn't know was that I had already briefed Marcus and Sarah on exactly what Elena would try to do, and they were ready with the right questions. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah said, reviewing the proposed documents, these transfers would essentially give you complete control over your father's assets. Can you explain the tax advantages of this structure? Elena launched into a complex explanation that sounded convincing, but was actually designed to hide the fact that the transfers would benefit her rather than Richard. Marcus asked seemingly innocent questions that exposed the flaws in her reasoning. Elena, I'm not understanding how moving assets to these particular accounts helps with tax planning. These look like personal accounts rather than tax-advantaged structures. They're special trust accounts, Elena replied smoothly. Very sophisticated tax planning that most people wouldn't understand. I'd like to see the trust documents, Sarah said. As Mr. Morrison's attorney, I need to review any legal structures that affect his assets. Elena looked uncomfortable. The documents aren't ready yet. This is just the preliminary transfer to establish the accounts. That's when Marcus delivered the killing blow. Elena, I've been looking at some of Richard's recent financial statements, and I'm seeing some transactions that I don't understand. Can you help me trace these transfers? He spread out documents showing the money that Elena and Vivian had already stolen, organized in a way that made the pattern of theft undeniable. Elena went very still. I don't know what you're implying, Marcus. I'm not implying anything, Marcus said calmly. I'm asking direct questions about specific financial transactions. Where did this money go? The meeting fell apart quickly after that. Elena tried to bluster and deflect, but the evidence was overwhelming. Richard looked confused and hurt, beginning to understand that his daughter had been stealing from him for years. Elena, he said quietly, I think we need to postpone any financial decisions until I understand what's been happening with my accounts. Elena made one last desperate play. Dad, you're getting confused again. This is exactly why we need to simplify your financial management. Marcus is trying to manipulate you with documents you don't understand. But Richard wasn't confused at all. Years of business experience had taught him to recognize deception, and Elena's behavior was setting off every alarm bell he had. I understand perfectly, Richard said, his voice cold. I understand that money has been moved out of my accounts without my knowledge or consent. I understand that you've been making financial decisions that benefit you rather than me. And I understand that you just tried to gaslight me about my own mental capacity. That night, Elena confronted me again, but this time she was desperate rather than threatening. You did this, she hissed. You turned Richard against me. I didn't turn anyone against anyone, I said. I just made sure he had access to accurate information about his own finances. You have no idea what you've done, Elena said. Richard needs my help. Without me, he'll be confused and vulnerable. He seems pretty clear-headed to me, I replied. Clear-headed enough to understand that he's been stolen from. You think you're so smart, Vivian added, appearing in my doorway. But you're still just a stupid little girl. We'll find a way to fix this. Maybe, I said. But you should know that everything that happened in that meeting was recorded. And I've been documenting your activities for months. If anything happens to me or to Grandpa Richard, there are people who will know exactly where to look. The final confrontation came 3 days later when Elena and Vivian made their last desperate move. They tried to have Richard declared mentally incompetent, using a doctor they had been secretly consulting and medication they had been giving him without his knowledge. But I was ready for this too. I had been carefully monitoring Richard's food and medication, and I had documented the times when Elena had been drugging him with psychiatric medications that weren't prescribed. I had video evidence of them discussing their plans, and I had medical experts ready to testify about Richard's actual mental state. When Elena's lawyer filed the competency petition, Sarah Kim was ready with a counter-filing that included criminal referrals for elder abuse, financial fraud, and attempted poisoning. The case exploded into the headlines within 24 hours. Telecommunications billionaire targeted by family and elder abuse scheme read the front page of the Financial News, stepdaughter and granddaughter accused of systematic theft and attempted poisoning. Elena and Vivian tried to paint me as a troubled teenager with a history of mental health issues, but the evidence was too strong and too well documented. I had recordings of their conversations, video evidence of their crimes, and financial records that traced every stolen dollar. More importantly, I had allies. Marcus Chen became Richard's advocate and business manager, ensuring that his affairs were handled properly. Sarah Kim represented his legal interests and coordinated with prosecutors. Dr. Patterson provided expert testimony about my mental state and the validity of the evidence I had gathered. The criminal trial was swift and decisive. Elena and Vivian were charged with elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and attempted poisoning. The evidence was so overwhelming that their attorneys advised them to accept plea deals rather than risk longer sentences at trial. Elena received 18 years in federal prison. Vivian got 15 years. Both were ordered to pay full restitution for the money they had stolen. Though most of it had already been recovered through asset forfeiture, the civil case was even more devastating. Richard sued them for the return of all stolen assets, plus punitive damages. The court awarded him triple damages, effectively bankrupting both Elena and Vivian for the rest of their lives. But the most satisfying moment came during the sentencing hearing, when I was allowed to give a victim impact statement on Richard's behalf. Your Honors, I said, standing at the podium and looking directly at Elena and Vivian. These women didn't just steal money. They stole years of happiness and peace from a man who had spent his entire life helping others. They isolated him from his friends, undermined his confidence, and made him doubt his own memory and judgment. They turned his own home into a prison where he was afraid to trust his own family. I paused, letting the weight of their crimes sink in. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated their victim. Richard Morrison built a telecommunications empire because he understood the importance of connections between people, between communities, between those who need help and those who can provide it. When they tried to cut those connections, they forgot that real relationships can't be destroyed by manipulation and lies. Elena was staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. Vivian was crying, though whether from remorse or self-pity, I couldn't tell. They also underestimated me, I continued. They thought I was just a troubled teenager who could be silenced and controlled. They didn't realize that someone who grows up in an abusive household learns to be very, very observant. I saw everything they did, and I remembered everything I saw. The judge nodded approvingly. Thank you, Miss Morrison. Your courage in coming forward and your careful documentation of these crimes undoubtedly saved your grandfather from further abuse and helped ensure that justice was served. After the trial, Richard and I rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. He was grateful for my protection, but more than that, he was proud of the strength and intelligence I had shown in fighting back against our abusers. You know, he said one evening as we sat in his study, reviewing plans for his charitable foundation, I always knew you were special. Even when Elena was trying to convince me that you were troubled, I could see the intelligence and determination in your eyes. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. Because I was afraid, he admitted. Elena was very convincing, and I didn't trust my own judgment. The stroke had shaken my confidence, and I was vulnerable to her manipulation. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. You don't need to apologize, I said. Elena was a professional manipulator. She fooled a lot of people, not just you. But you saw through her, Richard pointed out. You were just a teenager, but you understood what she was doing and you figured out how to stop her. I had advantages, I said carefully. I couldn't tell him about my rebirth and the memories of my original timeline, but I could share some of the truth. I've always been good at reading people and situations, and I had time to plan. Richard updated his will to reflect his original intentions, leaving the majority of his estate to charitable causes, while ensuring that I would have enough to pursue my education and start my adult life comfortably. But more importantly, he made sure I understood that I was loved and valued for who I was, not just as an heir to his fortune. I went to college with a full scholarship and majored in business and law, preparing to take over management of Richard's charitable foundation. The Richard Morrison Foundation for Elder Protection became one of the most effective organizations in the country for preventing and prosecuting elder abuse. We helped hundreds of families avoid the trauma that Elena and Vivian had inflicted on us. We funded legal aid programs, supported investigative journalism, and lobbied for stronger laws protecting elderly people from financial exploitation.